Hello, my friends. My name is Ben. Tonight we journey to a quiet hill where the stars are gentle and the air carries the scent of pine and memory. Far from the sea, a lighthouse still glows, not for ships, but for hearts that wander in the fog. This is a story of stillness and warmth, of a lantern that never falters, and a keeper who lights it every night, just in case someone is still searching. Let the world soften around you, let your breath deepen, and let this story carry you gently to sleep. Welcome to the Lantern Keeper's Secret, a story for those who remember and those who are still finding their way. On the edge of a quiet village, where stone paths wound between whispering pines and sleepy meadows, stood a lighthouse that had never seen the sea. It perched high on Maple Hill, surrounded by golden grasses and slow-drifting clouds, its lantern glowing each night not for ships, but for something else. The villagers called it the Landlight. No one remembered when it first began to shine, but they all knew it never stopped. It lit up just after sunset, casting a warm amber glow across the hill, visible from every window in the village. Children made up stories about sky ships searching for home or lost stars resting on the hill. Some believed it was magic. Others thought it was just habit. But only one person knew for sure: Elliot, the lantern keeper. He lived alone in a cottage tucked beneath the tower, hidden by ivy and wild roses. He had silver hair, quiet hands, and a slow way of moving, as if time flowed differently around him. He came into the village once a week, buying tea, bread, and always blackberry jam. He never spoke of the light, and no one asked. Every evening, Elliot lit the lantern with the same careful rhythm. He would walk up the winding stairs, polish the glass, check the oil, and strike a single match. The flame would catch with a soft glow, warm and steady. He would sit beside it, watching the valley fade into blue, and hum an old tune only he remembered. Just before the first star blinked into the sky, he would whisper, "Let her find her way." Every evening, when the shadows began to stretch long across the fields, and the pines whispered their nighttime songs, Elliot would begin his walk. The path from his cottage to the tower was lined with flat stones and old lantern posts that hadn't worked in years. But he didn't need their light. He knew the trail by heart. Every bend, every mossy patch, every place where the wind changed direction. He carried a small lantern of his own, not to see, but to honor the habit. Its light flickered gently against the grass as he climbed. The tower door creaked open with a familiar groan. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of smoke and lavender. The spiral staircase wound tightly upward, each step worn smooth from years of use. Elliot took his time. He had no reason to rush. The light was never late. At the top was the lantern room, round and quiet, with glass windows looking out over hills and valleys. There were maps on the walls, some yellowed and curled, some drawn by hand in shaky ink. A kettle rested on a small iron stove, and beside it sat a chair carved with moons and stars, its cushion faded but soft. Elliot would place his lantern on the table, then open the main lamp. He would polish the inside glass with a cloth that smelled of beeswax and cedar, check the wick, and pour in the oil with steady hands. Then he'd strike a single match. The flame flared for a moment, then settled into a steady golden pulse, like a heartbeat made of light. Once the lantern was lit, Elliot would sit in his chair, wrap his shawl around his shoulders, and sip a warm cup of tea. He'd hum, very quietly, a tune no one else remembered. Sometimes he would close his eyes and listen to the wind brushing against the glass, to the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, to the silence between things. One evening, just as Elliot lit the lantern and the tea on the stove began to steam, he heard something unusual. A soft knock, not hurried, not loud, just a small tap on the tower door, barely rising above the wind. He paused. No one ever came to the tower. Not in all the years he had tended the light. The last time he'd heard a knock was so long ago, it felt more like a memory than a moment. He opened the door gently, and there, standing in the dusk, was a boy. He was perhaps 8 or 9, with tangled hair and mud on his shoes, his cheeks pink from the climb. Around his neck hung a small brass bell, tied with a piece of fraying string. "I'm lost," the boy said softly. The path disappeared. Elliot looked at him for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Then come inside. Paths have a way of returning when we rest." The boy entered shyly, eyes wide at the spiral stairs. The warm golden glow of the lantern, the soft hum of the tower itself. Elliot poured a second cup of tea, added a spoonful of honey, and handed it to the boy with a nod. They sat together in quiet for a while, the boy sipping his tea, the lantern casting long shadows across the wooden floor. "What's your name?" Elliot asked. The boy hesitated, then said, "I don't know. I think I had one, but I forgot it in the fog." Elliot didn't seem surprised. He simply nodded. "Sometimes names hide when we are far from home. They'll come back when you're ready." He glanced at the little bell. "That's a good thing to carry, though. Bells remember the way, even when we don't." The boy touched the bell gently, as if to test its truth. That night, the boy sat beside Elliot. As he tended the flame, they polished the glass together, filled the oil with careful hands, and watched the light bloom across the valley. The boy didn't speak much, but once he whispered, "I think I dreamed of this place." Elliot smiled. "Maybe you did, or maybe this place dreamed of you." Before the stars arrived, Elliot leaned toward the glass and whispered as always, "Let her find her way." But this time, as the wind moved through the tower, the boy added a soft echo of his own, "And let us not forget ours." After the boy arrived, something began to change. Not all at once, but slowly, like the way shadows lengthen across a field as the sun sets. It was a quiet change, a shift in the wind, a hush that settled differently over the tower each evening. More people began to come. Not travelers on the road, not anyone from the village, but people who felt like dreams half remembered or memories from another life. They arrived at dusk, always at dusk. Each one climbed the path with the same distant look in their eyes, as if they had followed a thread no one else could see. There was an old woman who carried a bundle of dried flowers and spoke only in lullabies. A man with a cracked leather satchel who sat in silence for hours, sketching faces no one recognized. A girl in a red coat who claimed the wind had whispered directions to her in her sleep. Elliot welcomed them all. He made tea for each of them, offered a blanket, lit a second candle if they stayed longer than expected. He never asked why they had come. He didn't need to. There was something about the tower and the lantern that drew in those who had forgotten what they were looking for. Inside the lantern room, the chairs multiplied. Elliot found old wooden stools stored in the tower's cellar. The boy dragged up cushions from the cottage. Visitors even left things behind: a quilt, a shawl, a teacup with painted violets. Some nights were silent. Others were filled with the soft murmur of voices sharing stories no one had told in years. A man once cried, not knowing why, and Elliot simply placed a hand on his shoulder and let him sit in the light until he stopped. Another woman came and left without saying a word, but she left a paper crane on the windowsill that fluttered in the wind for days afterward. They all came seeking something. They all left a little lighter. And always, when the night deepened and the stars turned overhead, Elliot would rise from his chair and walk to the lantern. He would check the flame. He would listen to the wind. Then, in a voice that never wavered, he would whisper, "Let her find her way." And now, he was not the only one who spoke it. The boy said it too. Sometimes the others joined in, softly, like a lullaby passed through generations. The room would fill with that shared breath, that tiny act of hope, and for a moment, the light would seem to burn a little brighter. Outside, the mist would carry their voices far beyond the hill, into the woods, over the fields, and toward whatever souls were still searching in the dark. It was a quiet evening in the middle of autumn, the kind of evening when the world feels like it's holding its breath. The sun had long since dipped below the hills, and the air was cool enough that Elliot wore his heavier shawl as he carried 2 steaming cups of tea up to the lantern room. The boy was already there, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a small feather in his hand, spinning it slowly between his fingers. They had just finished their evening routine, cleaning the glass, checking the wick, filling the oil. The flame burned bright and warm in the center of the lantern, casting a soft, pulsing glow against the walls. For a while, they just Saturday. No visitors had come that evening. The tower was silent, save for the soft crackle of the lamp and the occasional creak of the wood as the old beams settled. Then the boy spoke. "Why do you keep the lantern burning?" Elliot didn't answer immediately. He blew gently on his tea, set the cup down, and walked to the wide window that faced the horizon. He stood there for a while, watching the hills in the distance fade into a soft silver-blue mist, their edges barely visible against the sky. Finally, in a quiet voice, he said, "There was someone." The boy didn't speak. He simply waited. "She left a long time ago, before this tower was built, before I had grey in my hair and a cane in my hand, before the hill had a name, and long before anyone called me the Lantern Keeper." Elliot paused. "She had a restless heart," he said, "always searching, always looking for something just beyond the horizon." He turned slightly toward the boy, though his gaze remained distant. "She told me she couldn't stay, but she said she'd try to return. And I told her I would keep a light burning for her, so she could find her way back if ever she forgot the path." The boy shifted slightly, looking toward the lantern. "How long ago?" he asked. Elliot gave a small smile. "Long enough that most would have given up." He touched the edge of the window with his fingertips. "But time doesn't matter when you're waiting for someone who carries part of your heart." The boy looked down at his own cup, then up at the flame. "Do you think she's still out there?" Elliot nodded. "I do. Maybe not in the way I remember. Maybe not with the same name or the same face. But yes, somewhere, still searching." The boy tilted his head. "Then the lantern isn't just for her, it's for you too." Elliot turned fully now, looking at the boy with soft, surprised eyes. And after a long pause, he said, "Yes, it keeps the dark from growing too heavy. It reminds me I'm still waiting, still hoping. And as long as the flame burns, part of her still knows where home is." They sat in silence after that. The kind of silence that says more than words ever could. Outside, the wind moved gently around the tower, brushing past the stones like an old friend. The boy reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small stone, smooth and flat, with a hole through the middle. "I found this in the grass by the path," he said. "I think it's lucky." He placed it on the table beside the lantern. "For her," he added. Elliot smiled again, and this time it reached all the way to his eyes. When the sky deepened and the first stars began to blink into place, Elliot stood. He opened the glass door of the lantern just for a moment and whispered, "Let her find her way." And beside him, the boy whispered too, "Let her feel the flame." The storm came without warning. One moment, the valley below was still, the grasses quiet beneath a darkening sky. The next, the wind arrived, not as a breeze, but as a voice, wild and deep, rattling the tower windows and bending the pines on Maple Hill. Rain followed in heavy sheets, drumming on the stone walls like 1,000 fingertips. Lightning cracked open the sky with jagged white fire, and thunder rolled through the valley like the sound of mountains shifting. The boy pressed his face to the window, wide-eyed. "Is it safe?" he asked. Elliot moved calmly around the room, checking the lantern's glass, securing the latches, folding up loose maps that fluttered in the wind. "It's safe as long as we protect the flame," he said. The tower groaned under the weight of the wind, its old stones trembling. Candles flickered and went out one by one. But the lantern, the great lantern, remained strong. Its flame swayed gently, but held steady, a golden heart in the eye of the storm. The boy held onto the leg of the table as the wind howled louder. "It feels like the whole world is shaking," he said. Elliot nodded. "Sometimes it does," he replied, "but storms always pass." He walked to the window and opened it just a crack. Rain sprayed through in fine mist, but the noise seemed to calm a little, as though the tower itself had taken a breath. Then Elliot did something the boy didn't expect. He stepped out onto the balcony. "Wait," the boy called, but Elliot only turned and smiled. "We must show the storm we're not afraid," he said. "We must let it see the light." The boy hesitated for only a moment before following him. Together, they stood on the stone balcony, soaked in wind and rain, holding onto the railing as the sky blazed above them. Elliot raised a hand toward the lantern behind the glass. The boy did the same, and for one breathless moment, a bolt of lightning split the sky directly above the hill. The entire valley lit up in blinding silver, and in that flash of light, the boy thought he saw something. Not quite a ship, not quite a bird, but a shape moving through the clouds, watching them with eyes as old as time. Then the light vanished. The sky went dark again, and the storm began to soften. The wind no longer screamed. The rain slowed to a whisper. The boy blinked and looked up at Elliot. "Did you see it?" he asked. Elliot's face was calm. "I've seen many storms," he said, "and some of them have watchers." They went back inside, dripping wet, their clothes clinging to their skin. Elliot lit the candles again, one by one, while the boy stood near the stove to warm his hands. The lantern still burned, as if nothing had happened, as if it had always known it would be fine. Elliot poured tea for both of them and brought out a small tin of sugar biscuits wrapped in cloth. They sat together in silence, drinking tea and listening to the gentle thrum of water sliding down the tower walls. The boy finally whispered, "Why do you think the storm came?" Elliot looked toward the flame. "Sometimes the sky needs to remember its own power," he said, "and sometimes it comes to see if our light still shines." Later that night, when the clouds had broken and stars peeked out from behind the fading mist, Elliot opened the lantern's door just slightly, leaned toward the valley, and whispered, "Let her find her way." The boy, now wrapped in a dry blanket, added, "And let the storms know we're still here." The fog came with the dawn. Not the kind that hovers gently above the fields or slides along the tops of fences, but a deep, thick fog that poured into the valley like a tide. It rose up the hill in slow, swirling waves, covering everything in a blanket of stillness. The trees disappeared. The village below vanished. Even the sky seemed erased, replaced by endless grey. From the lantern room, Elliot and the boy could see only the nearest pines and the faint outline of the tower's railing. Everything else had gone quiet and colourless. The lantern still burned, a soft golden globe in the middle of all that pale nothing. It looked fragile and brave, like a candle on the edge of the world. The boy leaned on the windowsill, watching the fog shift and twist, as though it was thinking its own thoughts. "It feels like we're floating," he said. Elliot, who had been quietly sipping his tea, nodded. Sometimes the world becomes small so something important can find its way in. For a long time, they said nothing. The fog didn't lift. The wind didn't move. Even the birds were silent, as if holding their breath. Then the boy gasped softly. "There," he said, pointing. Out of the whiteness, a shape was forming. At first, it was only a shadow. Then, it became a figure. Someone walking slowly up the winding path, their steps careful, as if remembering where each stone should be. The shape grew clearer. A woman in a long blue shawl, worn thin at the edges. She moved as though she had been walking for a long, long time, but had never once considered stopping. Elliot stood up and took a step toward the window, his hand resting against the cold glass. His breath caught in his throat, but he said nothing. The boy looked up at him. "Is it her?" he asked quietly. Elliot's eyes were locked on the figure. "I don't know," he said, but his voice shook just slightly, like a string pulled too tight. The woman reached the tower door and paused, looking up toward the lantern room. Her shawl fluttered slightly, and though the fog still clung to her figure, her face was calm, her eyes full of light. She didn't knock. She didn't need to. Elliot was already on his way down the stairs, one hand on the railing, the other gripping the edge of his coat. The boy followed close behind, not speaking, but wide-eyed with wonder. When they opened the door, she was waiting. She smiled. It was the kind of smile that unfolds slowly, like a memory returning. The kind of smile that belongs to someone who once made a promise and came back to keep it. "I followed the light," she said. Elliot stared at her for a moment, his eyes filling with warmth and sorrow and joy, all at once. "I never stopped lighting it," he said. They stood there like that, not touching, not speaking further, as if letting the years gently settle around them. Then the boy gently took the woman's hand and guided her up the stairs, his other hand steady on Elliot's sleeve. In the lantern room, they sat together, Elliot, the boy, and the woman wrapped in blue. They spoke little. There was no need. The flame flickered between them, casting soft light across their faces. It danced in her eyes, and Elliot thought he saw the reflection of stars. She reached into her shawl and brought out a small stone, flat, pale, with the shape of a heart etched into its center. She placed it gently beside the lantern. "It's from the riverbed beyond the dreaming trees," she said. "I carried it for years. I didn't know why until now." Elliot touched the stone with his fingertip. His hand trembled slightly. "Thank you," he whispered. When the fog began to lift and the trees below came back into view, Elliot stood beside the lantern once more. He opened its glass door, the hinges creaking in the cool morning air. He looked out over the valley, breathed in the scent of wet earth and wood smoke, and whispered, "Let her find her way." But this time, he said it not for her, but for someone else who might be searching still. The days that followed were the quiet kind, wrapped in soft winds and slow afternoons. The fog lifted, but its memory lingered. In the damp earth, in the hush of the forest, in the way the light hit the tower at dusk. The woman stayed. She did not ask to. She simply belonged, as if she had always been a part of the hill, just waiting for the moment to return. Her name was never spoken aloud. Neither Elliot nor the boy asked for it, and she offered nothing but smiles and the songs she hummed while tending the small garden behind the cottage. But the light in Elliot's eyes changed. He moved more slowly, but also more freely, like a door had been opened inside him and the wind could pass through at last. The boy noticed too. He noticed the way Elliot stood a little taller when the woman brushed dust from the window ledge. The way she touched his shoulder gently when he drifted off in the chair after tea. The way the lantern seemed to glow a bit more warmly when all three of them sat together near its light. They fell into rhythm, like notes in the same song. Elliot lit the lantern. The boy brewed the tea. The woman brought flowers inside, placing them in a chipped ceramic vase near the compass on the shelf. Visitors still came. They found their way through rain, through snow, even through silence, and the tower welcomed them all. The woman listened to their stories. She never judged, only nodded, as if she too had once been searching for something she didn't fully understand. She was kind to the boy, offering him threads for his bells and showing him how to stitch buttons onto his coat. She taught him the names of stars, but only the ones that don't appear on maps. And she walked with Elliot often. Slow walks around the hill, saying little, letting the sound of birds and leaves fill the spaces where words didn't need to go. Number 1.5 number. One morning, the boy woke early to find Elliot and the woman sitting in the lantern room, watching the first light of dawn spill across the fields. They didn't speak when he entered. They only smiled and motioned for him to sit. The lantern still glowed faintly, its flame calm and content. Elliot stood and opened its little glass door. He placed a polished stone inside, not to burn, but to stay, like a quiet piece of memory sealed in the light. Then he whispered, "Let her find her way." The woman placed her hand on his. The boy added, "Let them all find their way." And the three of them stood there in the quiet morning, wrapped in lantern light and something deeper than words. Seasons passed, but the lantern never failed. Some say Elliot grew older. Some say he did not. But the tower on Maple Hill remained. Stone against sky, wood against wind, light against dark. The villagers still looked up at it every night. The flame still burned. And those who were lost, or tired, or simply unsure where they belonged, still found their way to the winding path and the warm circle of the lantern's glow. Sometimes they stayed. Sometimes they only needed a cup of tea and a moment of silence. But they all left with something more than they arrived with. A little light, a little peace, a little hope. And deep within the lantern, beneath its glass, the polished stone still rested, smooth and small and waiting in case it was ever needed again. The keeper, the woman, and the boy were never seen far from the tower. Perhaps they grew older. Perhaps they became part of the hill itself. But if you look up on a quiet night, when the wind is still and the stars feel closer than usual, you'll see the light, still glowing, still waiting. And if you listen closely, just beneath the hush of the breeze, you may hear a voice whisper, "Let her find her way." And so, the keeper was no longer alone. The lantern, once a silent hope, became a hearth for stories, for laughter, for peace. The hill stayed quiet, the stars kept watch, and the lighthouse glowed through every season, a warm reminder that some promises never fade. As you close your eyes now, remember this gentle hill, the glow on the horizon, the quiet hum of memory. Let it guide you through your dreams tonight, like a lantern in your heart. Good night. Sleep well.